So we're going to do a Bible study today on the Mount of Olives, and this is sort of a prerequisite for understanding the events that are going to take place at the midpoint when the remnant of Israel flees. And this takes place in conjunction with the destruction of Mystery Babylon and the abomination of desolation. And the Mount of Olives is going to be a part of this story. And so I want to talk about that today. And I think it's really important to lay a foundation for this place because this place has so much going on there. In fact, the Jews call the Mount of Olives the Gate of God. And as we go on in this Bible study, I think you'll understand why they call it the Gate of God and how in many ways it's a kind of a portal. It's a place where God makes his entrances and makes his exits. So in order to really get a good understanding for the timeline, for the book of Revelation, for things that are happening in Revelation, we actually have to have a history and an understanding of the Mount of Olives. One of the things that sort of spurred me to talk about the Mount of Olives is the fact that they're having a Noahide, Sanhedrin, 70 nation sacrifice on the Mount of Olives on September 27th of 2019. And this is a totally unnecessary sacrifice. It's not anything that's required in scriptures. It's not even hinted at that this is something that needs to be done. And the fact is it's going to be done on the Mount of Olives, which really set off some alarms for me. So I decided to do this video on the Mount of Olives, and I may actually give this video a different name than a Revelation's Timelines of the End name, because I think it's a really important video for people to understand. So what we're going to look at is the history in the Old Testament of the Mount of Olives, the things that took place there in the past, the relationship of the Mount of Olives to the temple and the Temple Mount, the relationship of the Mount of Olives to the life of Christ, and how the Mount of Olives is going to be a setting for a lot of events that are going to take place during the time of the end, in particular at the midpoint. So historically, the Jews have a tradition that Noah offered his sacrifice after the flood actually on the Mount of Olives. So that's, I think, the main reason why they're saying that they're going to be doing this offering on the Mount of Olives. Obviously, they can't do it on the Temple Mount, and this is not something that Gentiles could do anyway, sacrifice something in the temple, and according to the Jews themselves, they're not allowed to do this sacrifice. So I personally don't think this sacrifice is relevant at all, and it's certainly not mandated in Scripture. But it's going to be taking place on the Mount of Olives, and I'm pretty sure they're going to say it's because that's where Noah offered that sacrifice. So the next story in the Bible doesn't specifically indicate that the Mount of Olives is the place. But you get to choose between the Temple Mount or the Mount of Olives as far as the setting for this particular story. And this is the story of Abraham offering up his son Isaac. And God tells Abraham that he wants him to go to the mountains of Moriah, or some Bibles will say the region or the land of Moriah, and that God will show him a mountain and that he's to offer up his son on that mountain. And a lot of people think, oh, that's the Temple Mount, but probably, most likely, it was the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is the higher peak. Also, Melchizedek was the king and priest of Salem, which is another name for Jerusalem, and he may have had an altar there as well. But the typology of Abraham as a type or symbol of God the Father, offering up his only son, the son of promise. In Abraham's case, it's Isaac. With God, it was his only son, Jesus. And there's a lot of symbolism there that we can get into later. The next place we see in Scripture where we see the Mount of Olives is actually in 2 Samuel 15. And this is where David is leaving Jerusalem because Absalom has set himself up as king. So David is going over the Mount of Olives, and that's exactly what it says in 2 Samuel 15:30. And David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, his head covered, and he walked barefoot. And then down in verse 32 it says, it happened that as David was coming to the summit where God was worshipped, that behold, Hushai the Archite met him with his coat torn. So at the summit of the Mount of Olives, there was a place of worship. And that's where David used to worship before the temple was built. And this was an actual place of sacrifice, an altar, and a place where he worshiped. So that's something that most people don't know. The next time we see the Mount of Olives, it's not name by name, but we know that it is talking about the Mount of Olives, is in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel has a vision of God destroying the city of Jerusalem. This is at the time of the Babylonian captivity when Nebuchadnezzar came in and was destroying the temple and carrying people off into Babylon. That God actually says he's the one who destroyed the city, destroyed the temple. Anyway, when the glory of God leaves the temple, it goes out the door, okay, and there's only one door in the temple, that's on the eastern side, crosses over the Kidron Valley, and then the glory of God goes to the mountain opposite the temple, that's the Mount of Olives, and from there, the glory of God went up into heaven. Now, in Ezekiel 43, we read about God's glory coming back again, okay, and this is going to be after the end, okay, this is before the millennium, this is after Christ returns, and the glory of God comes back on the Mount of Olives and then is going to cross back over into the temple. So the Jews will call the Mount of Olives God's footstool because that's where he left from and that's where it says that he's coming back to. This is in Ezekiel chapter 43. Also in Zechariah 14, we read about how the Lord, the Messiah, is going to put his feet on the Mount of Olives, and the mountain is going to split into two, going from north to south and creating a way for God's people to pass through. A lot of people refer to this passage in Zechariah as being about the second coming of Christ at the end of 7 years when his feet touch down. But if you read what's going on there, it's obvious that that isn't when he's doing this. When the mountain splits is when the people flee. Okay, there's an earthquake and God's the remnant of Israel, a third of Israel, is going to flee through that breach that's made between the mountains. And it's God's feet standing there. It's Christ's feet, the Messiah's feet standing there that's going to split the mountain. Those are the main places where we see the Mount of Olives in the Old Testament. So in the next video, we're going to take a look at the relationship of the Mount of Olives to the Temple Mount. And they're intimately connected, and there is a very special sacrifice that takes place on the Mount of Olives. That is the red heifer sacrifice, and I'm sure a lot of people are following the red heifer. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that sacrifice is going to be taking place and the significance of it and how it symbolically represented the sacrificial death of Christ. So I hope to see you on the next video. Till then, have a blessed day.